Nelson graduated from the University of Wisconsin. After teaching high school English in New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, she served as a state representative in the Illinois General Assembly. After an election loss, she became vice president of public affairs and director of the foundation at the Harris Bank in Chicago, followed by a stint as president of Leadership for Quality Education, and then executive director of the Cross-City Campaign for Urban School Reform. After moving to Holland, she joined HASP in 2013. She served on the Humanities Curriculum Subcommittee for 6 years and has coordinated the HASP nonfiction books group since 2016. This summer, she was elected to a 3-year term on the HASP Board of Directors. When I asked Diana how she wanted to be introduced, she replied, "Judy, I'm not big on long introductions. I'd be happy if you said Diana is a old English teacher who loves books." Thanks, Diana Nelson, for volunteering to teach Albert Camus' The Plague via Zoom. Help us to understand and appreciate this fine novel.
Judy, thank you so much. You're right. Thanks a lot. I have to tell everyone that for some odd reason, my Mac will not show me all the little boxes with your picture in it. So if you want to ask a question or interrupt, or if you want just to make a comment, please just speak up, because I'm not going to be calling on people. This is just a conversation about the plague. My intention is to just tell you a little bit about Albert Camus, and then go into some of the things that critics have said about this very famous book, which led to Nobel Prize, and then open it up for questions. And I'm hoping that we will be able to think about and make some comparisons between the plague that hit Iran, Algeria in the 40s, in fiction, in the book, and our pandemic today. So let's get started. And remember, just speak up whenever. This is how we do nonfiction books, and people can disagree agreeably and say whatever they want. The author, Albert Camus, it's really an interesting guy. In January 1941, the 28-year-old writer Albert Camus began work on a novel about a virus that spreads uncontrollably from animals to humans and ends up destroying half the population of a representative modern town. Iran, at 200,000 inhabitants, is just exactly the same size as Grand Rapids. The Plague was eventually published in 1947 and has been described as one of the greatest European novels of the post-war era. Camus was born in Algeria, where the plague is set. He spent his childhood in a very poor neighborhood. His mother scrubbed floors because his father had died when he was 1. But the French, they have a very meritocratic educational system. And so they grabbed him, and he later studied philosophy at the University of Algiers. He was in Paris when the Germans invaded France during World War II in 1940. He tried to flee, but finally joined the French resistance. And he served as editor-in-chief at Combat, an outlawed newspaper. At the liberation, he wrote, "Now that we have won the means to express ourselves, our responsibility to ourselves and to our country is paramount. The task for each of us is to think carefully about what he wants to say and gradually to shape the spirit of the paper. it is to write carefully wwithout ever losing sight of the urgent need to restore the country its authoritative voice. If we see to it that that voice remains one of vigor rather than hatred, of proud objectivity and not rhetoric, of humanity rather than mediocrity, then much will be saved from ruin. After the war, Camus was a celebrity figure and gave many lectures around the world. In 2012, Adam Gropnik wrote in the New Yorker, it was in the 40s that Camus became intimate with Sartre. Though each had known each other's writing before meeting, they became friends in Saint-Germain. In 1943, a time when the Café des Flores was not an expensive spot, but one of the few places with a warm radiator, they would sit and talk. And so for the next decade, French intellectual life was dominated by their double act, that is Camus and Sartre. Although Camus was married and soon afterward had a mistress, and soon after that had twins by his wife, after the twins were born, Camus' life went on exactly as before. His deepest emotional attachment seemed to have been to Sartre. Indeed, the image that we have in our mind of French philosophers sitting in a cafe talking dates from that moment. Question? Some years later, as Sartre's philosophy turned toward Marxism, the two men fell out and never spoke again. Camus married twice, but also had many extramarital affairs. He was politically active, but he was part of the left that opposed the Soviet Union because of its totalitarianism. Camus was a moralist. He was part of many organizations seeking European integration. During the Algerian War, 1954 to 62, he kept a neutral stance, advocating for a multicultural and pluralistic Algeria, a position that caused a lot of controversy and actually was rejected by most parties. Camus received the Nobel Prize for Literature at the age of 44 in 1957. The committee at that time that he received the Nobel Prize wrote a really, they write up a bio of all of their recipients and labeled him as a representative non-metropolitan French literature. In the bio that the committee wrote, it says he came to France at the age of 25 and the man and the times met. He wrote a book of philosophical essays called The Myth of Sisyphus in 1942, which, and I'm quoting again from this Nobel Prize little biographical piece, expounds Camus' notion of the absurd and its acceptance with the total absence of hope, which has nothing to do with despair. He also wrote The Stranger in 1942, which illustrates much of the essays of the previous Myth of Sisyphus. And this is what the Nobel Committee said about the play. It enacts the revolt against a world of the absurd and injustice and confirms Camus' words. We refuse to despair of mankind. Without having the unreasonable ambition to save men, we still want to serve them. Camus died in 1960, aged only 46, while he was being driven to his home in Provence by his publisher, Michel Gallimard. The car, a really powerful for the time, I don't know the name, but Facel Vega, veered off the road and hit two trees. Camus was killed instantly. The cause of the accident on a long stretch of straight, wide road remains a mystery, and there have been numerous theories. In his book, The Death of Camus, the Italian author, Catelli, suggested that the author may have been killed by the KGB after expressing his opposition to the Soviet regime. Well, who knows? Gopnik, in his New Yorker essay, called him a terrifically good-looking guy whom women fell for helplessly, the Don Draper of existentialism. So that's the end of the biographical material on Albert Camus. Any questions or comments before I go on to talk a little bit about the plot and Holland and Oran? Okay. Judy, can I ask you something? Can you hear me okay?
I certainly can.
Okay, that's all I want to know. My screen went blank for a minute. It was very weird. So anyway, as the novel opens, an air of eerie normality reigns. Here's what Camus writes. Oran is an ordinary town, nothing more than a French prefecture on the coast of Algeria. And he describes, you understand how it's on a plateau and the sea is behind seawalls and it's surrounded by mountains. So there are gates and it's easily isolated. The inhabitants lead busy, money-centered lives. They barely notice that they are alive. Then, with a pacing of a thriller, the horror begins. Dr. Ryu comes across a dead rat, and then, you know, the rats start piling up. They stumble out, and fall over, and spit blood, and put their noses in the air and die. The inhabitants accuse the authorities of not acting fast enough. All these things have a few little echoes. The rats are removed, the town heaves a sigh of relief, but Dr. Ryu suspects that this is not the end. He has read enough about plagues. Soon an epidemic seizes Oran, the disease transmitting itself from citizen to citizen. Now, in order to write the book, Camus immersed himself in the history of plagues. He read books on the Black Death that killed 50 million people in Europe in the 14th century. He read up about the Italian plague of 1629 that killed 280,000 people across Lombardy and areas of Italy. The Great Plague of London of 1665, as well as plagues that ravaged cities in China on the eastern seaboard during the 18th and 19th century. Camus was not writing about one plague in particular. He was drawn to his theme because in his philosophy, we all are, unbeknownst to us, living through a plague that is widespread, invisible, and may kill any of us at any time and destroy our lives. The actual historical incidents that we call plagues are really just concentrations of a universal precondition. They're dramatic instances of perpetual rule. We are vulnerable to being randomly exterminated by cancer, by a car accident, by a cop putting his knee on your throat at any second. So that's what he's trying to get through to us. Our exposure to plague is at the heart of Camus' view that our lives are fundamentally on the edge of what he termed the absurd. Proper recognition of the absurdity should not lead us to despair, pure and simple. It should, rightly understood, and this comes out in all the conversations in the book. You know, there are the three really good friends, and then there are a couple other major characters that we'll get into. But you know, we are much like the people of Iran. We go about our business thinking we're immortal, and this is, in Camus' thinking, naive. So the people of Iran associate plague with something backward that belongs to another age. Just like we do. I mean, how could this be happening here in the 21st century? It's impossible. It should be the plague. Everyone knows it has vanished from the West, says one character. Yes, everyone knew that, Camus adds sardonically, except the dead. For Camus, when it comes to dying, there is no progress in history. There's no escape from our frailty. Being alive is and always was an emergency. Life, in his view, is a hospice, not a hospital. So, how did you all find Iran and Holland similar or different? How are the inhabitants similar or different? What did you think? Anybody?
Well, I'm reading this. It
was fascinating, Diana, because I have.
Sue, you were about to say something? Unmute yourself, please, Sue.
Yeah, well, Norma started speaking, so I've muted myself. But anyway, I was looking at this, and that I think life now, we're so involved in making money and having things and materialism, and our government is looking at the economics rather than the public health part of it. So it's so interesting. I think we're experiencing some of that same thing as what do we need to keep the economy going, and regardless of public health concerns. So I think we're kind of stuck in that same situation here with making money is so important and health is not as meaningful. And so there's some similarities, I think, with our own lifestyle currently.
Norma?
Go ahead.
Norma, did you have a comment?
It's the same thing. I'm having problems still with my audio, so please forgive if my voice is garbled. But you know, seeing the similarity was totally fascinating. I mean, the denial, the efforts to control the population, people's busyness despite the impending doom, and the efforts of some to, in fact, make a difference in the right way. The questions of Father Panel, I think it's Panelu,
Yes.
his sermon, that you're getting what you deserved, you're sinful, you're awful, and then later he has some experience that might touch him. So it was both his characters and the similarity to what we have now going on was just totally fascinating.
This is a brilliant segue, because what I wanted to move on to is a discussion of some of the main characters in the book. And since you mentioned Father Panelu, let's examine him, and I have some questions about him. As you said, he's learned. He is a Jesuit priest. He is the only Christian in the book, as far as the main characters go. All the others, I mean, I'm speaking of Rambert, Tarot, and Dr. Ryu, do not believe in God when they are asked in the book directly, whether they do by another character. And Father Panlu, in his first sermon, as you said, Norma, he says you all the time, and he really says that God has sent the plague to those, you know, to you because you have hardened your hearts. And then the incident that happens is that all of them in a ward of the hospital witness the excruciatingly painful death of the young boy, M. Orthon's son. And Panelu then later on in the novel preaches a second sermon where he says, it's all or nothing. It's all or nothing. God willed innocent children to die, and you must believe that if God willed that, you will that. And if God wills that, then you have to believe that it has to be accepted, and that you either go in all the way or you are a disbeliever. And so that's the difference between the two sermons. Is in the first one he says you, in the second one he says we, but that is his belief, and that is how he is approaching his congregation. Somewhat shortly thereafter, he becomes ill of the plague and refuses any medical interventions, and he dies. So I'd like to ask all of you whether or not, let me just ask this. Okay, do you think that Father Panelu was a spiritual man? Do you think that and his sermons are extensively quoted in the novel, both of them. Do you think that represents, is that a fair representative of Christianity? Let's just discuss for a minute what you thought about him as a person and also him as a spiritual leader.
I'd like to mention that after the first sermon, the father of the little boy, Mr. Orthon, said about that first sermon that it was irrefutable, that he, in effect, said there was nothing that you can say to contradict. This is standard traditional Christian doctrine, and this is the father of the little boy saying that. I thought that was significant. What happens is after he just hardens it seems like the priest goes, it's an either or thing. And I think after the priest sees the death of the little boy, he and others start to see a third way. It's not either all faith or all science. There begins to be a concern for the victims. And the third way is to offer help, to offer healing. It's not either you're damned or you're blessed. It is that there is something we can do. I mentioned too that when the little boy gets sick, this is on pages 198 and 199 of the book. At one point, he's described as lying in the bed, arms and legs spread out crosswise. And again, the child lay flat, racked on the tumbled bed in a grotesque parody of the crucifixion. And I see that even though Camus fashions himself as a kind of humanist, rather than say a Christian, he's aware of Christianity. I think I read someplace that he did a master's thesis on St. Augustine, and perhaps in his education picked up a lot of notions of Christianity. But I think this concern for the victim, and the story about the little boy is one of the most heart-grabbing parts of the entire book for me, and it does change minds. As a matter of fact, one of the people in there, Teron, this is right after the word crucifixion, bending, Teron gently stroked with his big paw the small face stained with tears and sweat. And this changes, I think, Teron's life as well. Teron decides to stay on and become a helpful person. He helps the doctor go around and assist people.
I couldn't help but think that Hannibal, what we saw was some enlargement of his understanding of faith. You know, his first one was a pretty narrow, unloving take. Everybody's sinful. You deserve this. You're getting what you deserve. And just the experience with the child moved him enough to begin. You know, at one point he says, if what comes out of this is an increase in love, it will not, everything will not be lost.
Do you think that going back to Judy's comment, that seeing the death of so many innocents leads to a third way? And it's very, very clear that Camus, throughout the novel, is articulating that third way, which is to actually identify with the victims. I don't know the page, but I know at one point in conversation with his friends, Dr. Ewan they are talking, and the comment is made that there are always pestilences.
Page 236 and 237 in the book.
Good grief, thank you. And that there are always victims, and the thing is to identify with the victims. Judy, my book looks like this. Is this the same you have?
No, I have a different book, and it's by the recommended author, translator, Stuart Gilbert, and maybe the pagination is the same, maybe it's not.
Well, mine is a little off. Mine is also translated by Stuart Gilbert. But,
okay, so it'll be a different page.
But the point is, here's my question. Do you have to be a Christian to identify with the victims, to be what Mr. Rogers called one of the helpers, to be one of the ones who stays and helps set up the sanitary squads, for example? Is it necessary to be a Christian, or can you be an existentialist and still be a helper?
Right, a few pages on from where we were, Taru asks, can one be a saint without God? And then in replying to that, Taru said in a low voice, it was never over. There would always be more victims because that was the order of things. There'll never be a shortage of victims to help. But then this is when the doctor responds and he says, but you know, I feel more fellowship with the defeated than with the saints. Heroism and sanctity don't really appeal to me, I imagine. What interests me is being a man. And here's a call to humanism, to understand our humanity, understand that we are mortal, understand that the best things that we can do is to help one another face death, face sickness, perhaps become healers.
Yes, Tarot aspires, if you believe what he says, to be a saint. But to be a saint implies, to some extent, religiosity. And I believe that Dr. Ryu, when he says this, also goes on to say, Judy, yes, we're both after the same thing,
Exactly.
but I'm less ambitious. So I think, oh, I'm sorry. What interests me is being a man. And then Thoreau says, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Thoreau is the one who says being a saint is less ambitious than being a man. And that is at the heart of Camus' understanding of the philosophy that he, I believe, is espousing in the plague. But I have that in my book, Judy. That's page 231.
Okay.
Just to
I'd
say.
like to read a place where we get a delineation between what the Father Penello is considering love and what the physician is considering love.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Penello, I understand, Penello said in a low voice, that sort of thing is revolting because it passes our understanding, that is the death of innocent children. But perhaps we should love what we cannot understand. Rio straightened up slowly. He gazed at Penello, summoning to his gaze all the strength and fervor that he could muster against his weariness. Then he shook his head. No, Father, I've a very different idea of love. And until my dying day, I shall refuse to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture. And then later on, Penello
And I think that's very key.
Right. Father Penello sat down beside Rio. It was obvious that he was deeply moved. Yes, yes, he said, you two are working for man's salvation. Rio tried to smile. Salvation's much too big a word for me. I don't aim so high. I'm concerned with man's health. For me, his health comes first. And then later, it seems that at the end of that very section, what does it matter? What I hate is death and disease, as you well know. This is the doctor saying. And whether you wish it or not, we are allies, facing them and fighting them together. Rio was still holding Penello's hand. So you see, but he refrained from meeting the priest's eyes. God himself can't part us now. So the two of them come to an agreement, it seems, about what love is. And love is what is causing these two opposites, the faith side and the science side, to come together.
I think that's a very, very important passage in the book. And to describe it as allies, I think is a good way to put it. And I believe that that is perhaps one of the various interpretations of the book, which is this. Some readers of the novel, The Plague, equate the plague to Nazism. And there are, all kinds of ways to see that in the novel. And so for allies to join and combat the plague, I believe that this is a perfect illustration of how that leads one to that different interpretation. Any other comments at this point? I'd like to talk about some of the other characters and then fill you in on some of what different critics, different interpretations of the novel. But let's see what's out there. Any questions?
I have a question about the narrator. He keeps, the author keeps who is the narrator a kind of away from us until the very end. And I'm wondering why he's done that.
I have no idea. But what it does allow him to do is it allows him to dip into Tarot's journals for the picking up of some scenes and some places that Dr. Ryu himself might not have gone. For instance, you know, he didn't go to the opera with Cotard the time that the main singer on stage collapses from the plague and people rush out of the theater, and all kinds of, I think, possibilities are opened up by his access to essentially 2 points of view by being the narrator, but by also having access to Tarot's journals. And of course, he does comment way near the end of the novel that, and this was the last entry into the journal. And you think, well, why is that? Well, then you find out, of course, that Tarot dies and at his friend Ryu's house, and therefore Ryu would have had access to the journals and reveals himself. Speaking of John Teru, who is really another of the main characters, he appears to have private means. Before the plague came, he liked to associate with the Spanish dancers and musicians. And he has the most, I think, wonderful observations in his diary of Oran, which is incorporated. And he's the one that first comes up with the idea of organizing the sanitary squads, the teams of volunteers to fight the plague. He takes action prompted by his own code and his own morals. He feels, and this is, I think, very key, he feels that the plague is everybody's responsibility. And then, of course, Judy pointed out that conversation where he says he's interested in becoming a saint. And later on in the novel, Tarot does tell Dr. Ryu his backstory. And the backstory has to do with being brought up in a relatively well-to-do circumstances with a father who was, I think we would call him a prosecuting attorney, and how his father also had his hobby of, you know, studying the train schedules. So, you know, everyone is filled in. And then one day his father invites him to court to witness him making a speech and prosecuting a poor defendant who Tarot is struck by, and it changes his life. He becomes totally anti the death penalty and spends the entire rest of his life working for causes all over Europe. It sounds like that he probably partook in the Spanish Civil War and was very, very active all over Europe. Apparently happens to come to Iran just at this moment, but he is searching, and that's, I think, what makes him such an interesting figure. But I think one of the best scenes, the scene that I just love, is the scene where he and Dr. Ryu go swimming in the ocean, and you get some of Camus' just most striking descriptions of the sea and the night and the stars and the lighthouse light. You can't see the light from the lighthouse, but you can see the light coming and at intervals of probably a couple of minutes. But he is, I think, one of the key characters in the book. And I'm wondering if anybody had any questions about him or anything they found to be mysterious or incomprehensible about his philosophy.
I want to comment about where it is they were before they went swimming together. They decide to leave town, so to speak, and they almost had to do it in a clandestine way. But they went to a place that was high, a terrace, that they could overlook Oran. And for me, it was the introduction to transcendence, a way of getting above things and looking and trying to make sense of it all that was going on beneath them. And I thought that Camus did an excellent job in giving the setting for that, including the light from the lighthouse as well.
Absolutely. And Dr. Riroux returns there at the very, very end.
Yes.
To that terrace, because it is a terrace on the roof of the apartment house where his patient lives.
Yes.
And the beauty really of that interlude, if you will, where the two of them have an experience of friendship that is so evident. The physical exhilaration of swimming and cooling, and the highlighting of how much that friendship means. And it becomes an interlude that I think characterizes the strength of those two characters.
I think the swimming could even be could be construed even as a kind of baptism. Here I'm imposing my Christian view of it there, but I see it as having some baptismal significance to pray, confirming their friendship by means of water.
Okay. Let's agree to think about that. Norma, something else you said, interlude, I think is also something that I admire about the novel, which is that there are some horrible, gruesome, just abominable scenes of long, gruesome deaths. And yet somehow Camus is able to weave the novel with all kinds of scenes and comments and descriptions that keep you moving and keep you wanting to read along and find out about the characters, probably half of whom, the main characters anyway, die. Another interesting character is Raymond Rambert, the journalist, who is sent to Iran by his newspaper to write a story about conditions in the Arab quarter. And something lacking in the novel are any Arabs, which you would think would be odd since it's set in Algeria. But anyway, there are no Arabs in the novel. There are literally a sprinkling of women, but not real, what you and I would call fleshed out women characters. But anyway, Rambert comes as a journalist. Now he is he's all alone. He's not a native to the city. He's stuck there and he wants to escape. He really wants to get out because he wants to get back to his partner who is in Paris. Throughout the novel, she's alternately, well, she's described as his wife, but when she's mentioned in the first place, he says wife. Well, not really a wife, but so I would think of her as his partner. So he plots and schemes, and he spends pages and pages and pages trying to do things with the authorities to get out of there, trying all kinds of ways because he thinks he does not belong. I'm just stuck here by chance, he thinks. However, after the death of the little boy and many other things happen, he also changes. No, he not only tries to get out legitimately, but he tries to get smuggled out and is willing to pay 10,000 francs, I think, to have smugglers get him out of town. But he doesn't, and he stays. And I think I'd like to ask why you think he changes his mind and why you think he and Dr. Ryu are such good friends. Although Dr. Ryu is also good friends with, as we know, Jean Tarot.
I'm not
Any
sure if he was,
comments on Rambert?
yeah, I'm not sure if he was in the congregation when Pamela was giving his second sermon, but in that second sermon, he talks about the plague hitting a community of monks, and most of the monks go to other places to escape that plague. There are 3 that stay for a while, and then there's only one that stays to take care of people, the one that stays. And I think what we're talking about is, in this journalist, is he's one who's going to stay here to help. And maybe he heard that sermon and was affected by it. I wasn't sure if he was in the congregation at that point.
I think Rambert made a commitment to a higher self when he saw what was really happening, and he finally had the opportunity to leave, but he saw that he could really make a difference staying, and he made that commitment to stay, to be his best person. And I admired him for that, because he had the risk of contracting the illness, but he was healthy and young, and he could make a difference, and he said, with against all odds, I'm going to stay and help. And I really admired that quality in him.
At the bottom of page 149, Rambert speaks, and he sprang off the bed, his face ablaze with passion. Quote, "Man is an idea, just as you say, Sue, and a precious small idea once he turns his back on love. And that's the point. We, mankind, have lost our capacity for love. We must face that fact, Doctor. Let's wait to acquire that capacity, or if it's really beyond us, wait for the deliverance that will come to each of us anyway. Personally, I look no further. He's the one in the book that argues most passionately, I think, for love. Love is the answer. Love is the reason for being in life. If there is, if there has to be a reason found. Well, one other very odd and unlikable character is the criminal, Cotard. And he is a contrast to everyone else. He's introduced in the beginning. Gran finds him with a botched suicide, and then he recovers. And as the plague gets worse and worse and worse, he gets happier and happier and happier, and eventually makes money by smuggling, and his whole personality changes. He acts like a man, happy-go-lucky fellow, well-met kind of person. And why do you think he is in the novel?
Probably a contrast to all the other ones. He's the one at the end that goes insane, and he starts shooting, and he shoots at a dog that makes the kind of head over heels kind of dying gesture, that's comparable to the rat early on in chapter 1 that kind of pirouettes around and just suddenly falls over. It's for contrast, and perhaps it's for some comic effect, or just maybe the absurdity. Maybe he's a representative of the absurd.
Sometimes, Diana, I was struck by Camus' ability to paint characters in Iran that were unique and yet bear likeness too. There's also that fellow, why can I not remember the name, but his patient who is counting peas. I mean, he spends his life counting peas.
Yeah.
And it's, so we have a person who is just out of touch, who continues to live and does these most unhelpful things. I mean, there's no sense to it, but Camus includes the characters like Rimbaud, who seem to me to be, every man, pretty realistic, loving, active, wanting to get out of a bad scene, which we can understand. So it seems to me that Camus did a wonderful job of portraying the characters that we see kind of in our own lives, but there are lots of different characters.
Thank you. Well, the character of Dr. Ryu in the novel, of course, is Camus' alter ego. Dr. Ryu loathes the priest's approach. The plague, he believes, is not punishment for anything deserved. That would be to imagine that the universe was moral or had some sort of design to it. But Dr. Ryu does not believe that. Watching an innocent child die, he knows better. Suffering is entirely randomly distributed. It makes no sense. There is no ethical force. It is simply absurd. And that is how he sees the world. But he works tirelessly against death, and he tries to lessen the suffering of those around him. And he identifies with the victims. The whole thing is not about heroism, he says. In my book, this is on page 150. It's about decency, which consists of doing my job. He says, what interests me is in being a man. And the only thing I didn't quite get was why, Dr. Ryu is in his 30s, and his wife, Jean, is around age 30. Why do you think when she died, he showed such little emotion? That was odd, I thought. Anybody?
I think one point he mentions that he the two women in his life that he loved so much, he was never able to express it to them. He felt really badly because he never told his mother how much he loved her, nor his wife. And I think at some point, I can't tell you the page, but he really is, that's one of his regrets on how he can care for people's physical needs, but he's unable to really share the emotional wants and needs that people have. And I think, I wish I could give you the quotation, but he does mention that in his words.
Oh, so that's true. And near the end, he's thinking about a fresh start when he sees that finally the plague abating. But of course, at that time, he doesn't know that she has died.
Right. I think he's closed them. Sometimes in medicine, you close yourself off emotionally to all of the things that you see because you're dealing with people so ill and dying. And so and he did that also in his family life. And I think that's one of his regrets of not being able to express his feelings with those he loved so much.
I assume she died of tuberculosis because she is sent to a sanatorium.
And,
I'm sorry,
and of
Norma, go
course,
ahead. Say again, Norma. It was garbled.
okay, I'll try again. Also, he was working to the point of total exhaustion, and we need to recognize that. And his efforts were so much directed at the alleviation of disease and pain, and he was totally exhausted in doing that. We do have, there was mention, and I don't know where, but where he was in contact with a physician who was treating his wife. You know, he took the necessary physical means to help her. A nurse goes with her to the sanatorium. He speaks about having talked with the physician responsible for her care, and that in fact she was not doing well. So there are clues to the extent to which he could. There certainly was evidence of that caring, I thought.
Oh, no question. Mhm. Well, we have been talking for an hour. It's 10:30. I'm going to just switch slightly from our talk of different characters to share with you all some of the things that various critics have had to say about the book. And as always, please, please just speak up, particularly some of you who have not yet. Of course, you know, because I told you that this book was largely responsible for Camus receiving the Nobel Prize at a very early age. And it has been called a parable of ageless moral resonance, profoundly relevant to our times. And then, as I also suggested earlier, the plague can be interpreted to represent fascism, and it can be about the Nazi occupation of France. Like members of the resistance, of which Camus was one, Dr. Rioux knew that, quote, there must be no bowing down to the plague, no compromise with evil, no resignation to fate. You cannot. Albert Camus himself said that the novel could be read on several levels and was also an allegory of the French resistance to the pestilence of Nazism and the German occupation during the Second World War. I have I get the New York Times book review every week, and back in, I don't think you can see that, but anyway, forget that. Back in 1948, August 1st, the New York Times book review reviewed for the first time The Plague. And the review was written by Stephen Spender, and this is what he wrote. He wrote, August 1st, 1948, The Plague is a parable and sermon and should be considered as such. The message is not the highest form of creative art, but it may be of such importance for our time that to dismiss it in the name of artistic criticism would be to blaspheme against the human spirit. Against the background of events, he creates various attitudes of human beings toward the plague, heightened by touches of intimate observation. The plague thus becomes a sort of laboratory for studying attitudes toward itself. The attitude of the priest, who first regards it as a scourge of God, of the journalist Rambert, for whom it means separation from the woman he loves. Of Thoreau, for whom it becomes the occasion of realizing his passion to correct an injustice at the center of society. In realizing these attitudes, Camus shows his rarest quality, which is charity. Its sympathy saves this novel from being mere noble pamphleteering and raises it to the level of art. Perhaps most important of all today, 1948, it insists that politics must concern itself with the fate of the victims and not just the art of ruling the corrupt by corrupt means. So, do any of those critics' interpretations resonate with you? Do you have any comments?
I agree. I agree with Stephen Spender. He's a poet, and I think he was hitting on the essential qualities of this novel. But who are the victims today? Maybe we could talk about some of those and how are victims being helped or hindered?
Anybody else? Comments, questions?
I want to make sure that we notice also Helen had a comment about on the chat feature. Did everybody see that?
Oh, I missed it.
Don't
I
wanna
didn't
miss
have my
that.
chat
But
open. Thank you,
does seem
Norma.
like it.
About the snow, Helen, do you want to read your quote?
Yeah, the quote is, "The snow doesn't give a soft white damn whom it touches," and that's E.E. Cummings. A poem that for some reason is stuck in my head for years and years. And as you were talking about the victims and, you know, the irrationality and the absurdity of all of it, that sort of came to mind.
What about Judy's question? Today, who are the victims today? Are we speaking strictly of those who are who have caught and died, or perhaps not, of the coronavirus? What is your interpretation of our victims in this society? Or is it more likely that you think of victims in terms of Black Lives Matter, and that our victims are those in society who have been discriminated against for the entire history of our country? Or are there other victims that come to your mind?
It seems to
I think
me
this virus has pointed out that we have inequitable care systems for our population. It's been pointed out numerous times that minorities, Blacks, brown people, people of color, have not had the kind of hospital experiences and healing that a number of elite, white, wealthy people have received. I think that the virus has unveiled the inequities in our healthcare system, and we can change that by how we vote in November.
Yeah, I hate to say this because it sounds really extreme, but it seems to me it's almost like genocide by neglect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One way of thinking about the plague is that when you realize that of the three main characters, Dr. Ryu, Thoreau, and Rambert, none of them are Christian. They believe that there is no God, no afterlife. And the implications of that are to existentialists. Now, Camus always denied that he was an existentialist, but he is always listed as either a fellow traveler or someone in their camp. And existentialists have a view of the world that is close to that expressed by many of the main characters, which is that given, in their view, that there is no God, that there is no afterlife, therefore, what is to be done about it? Well, you could just commit suicide, but the other answer is to be found in creating an authentic life, to be a man or a woman and not aspire to be a saint. You just have one chance, one, and it's over, to create a worthy, authentic life and take the moral course of action and identify with the victims. So that, I think, is what undergirds Camus' philosophy, and I think that it is quite evident that he believes that one can live a life that is authentic and that is an ally of Christians like Father Panelou, but is not Christian. And I just wondered if reading the novel affected your thinking in any way, or if you disagreed, please speak up. I just, how are we different from those citizens of Iran?
It seems to me, from a generic point of view, you can see the situation we're in right now, and you can find players on the scene that represent some of these people. I mean, as this pandemic began, I was thinking to myself, I really want to read a book that talks about pandemics, because I think the themes that show up over and over and over again are probably the same. And so this book kind of coalesces that stuff. And I think you can look at what's happening to us today and you can find direct parallels to this stuff.
I'm going to read a quote from, or a comment, a chat from Norma. So much of the book seems to pose the question of what is life about. Our current situation seems to be elevating some recognition of victims.
Thank you.
No, I read one thing that originally his title might have been The Prisoners rather than The Plague. And I think you wanted to think about who were prisoners here and what were they prisoners of, and the separation of people. And it talked about the separation in terms of greed, lack of human love, indifference, the difference between the living and the dead, the separation of nature and then man in the universe and man in nature, because it talks about the town, how they don't really realize that the beauty of the place that they're in, and they're so into greed and banging things. So it's interesting. He's really contrasted a lot of things, and I think of Cotard as the person that is making money on masks and built. We had that same greed in our own country. All of a sudden, you are making money on something bad that's happening, and not feeling bad about it. He was the happiest when he was able to be the black market person and do all of the things. So I think we see some of that currently in what happened in the people that had the masks and the ventilators and pitting the groups against each other for the highest price. So a lot of what we see currently happened then, and it's cyclical. It's man's different people's response to a pandemic or a plague or something horrible happening in your environment. Some people want to take advantage. Some people become helpers. Some people become totally ineffective. It's just interesting. He was really able to characterize so many different responses we could have.
Right, thank you. Many times in the book, he refers to the people as exiles, especially when the town gates are closed. And he describes Iran as being an ugly city. Very little green grows. It's on a high plateau, but blocked from the sea, surrounded by mountains, and the heat bakes everything so that a fine dust settles, and then when the wind comes along, it just blows the dust, and it I think one of the things that was I appreciated a great deal, as you say, Sue, about the novel were the descriptions of not only the place but also the inhabitants. I'm reading in a on page in my book, it's 244, and he describes some of the people, and it's really quite near the end now. But he says they were, in short, behind the times. In the case of others, chiefly those who had been living until now in forced separation from those they loved, the rising wind of hope, after all these months of depression, had fanned impatience to a blaze and swept away their self-control. They were seized with a sort of panic at the thought they might die so near the goal and never see again the ones they loved, and their long privation have no recompense. Thus, though for weary months and months they had endured their long ordeal with dogged perseverance, the first thrill of hope had been enough to shatter what fear and hopelessness had failed to impair. And in the frenzy of their haste, they tried to outstrip the plague, incapable of keeping pace with it to the end. So we have no idea how long we are going to be sheltering in place in this pandemic. And I'm just wondering if when we hear news of vaccine being developed and inoculation starting in different parts of our country, will we have this reaction? Will we change? What do you think? What do you think will happen when we begin to see the beginning of the end?
We've gotten a foretaste of that, I think, when they've had a reopening after the closures, beginning of, say, June for some places, that people suddenly went to the beaches and went to the bars and celebrated. And we saw some of that in this novel as well, when the end seems near and they open the gates and people celebrate. And they're thinking about making a fresh start. That phrase, fresh start, repeats over and over again about 20 pages from the end. There's rejoicing, and I'm not sure how long this plague in this novel lasts. It seems to begin sort of in spring.
I know exactly. It begins in April. And
okay, when did it start?
It begins in April.
Okay, so April to April?
Oh, yes. April to at least March. Because
okay, so it's a year.
It's a year. The gates are opened in March. And the first rat dies on April 17th or something like that.
Wow.
So, but it plague, the 5 parts of the novel are divided into, it's almost like, the 5 acts of a Shakespeare play. The characters are introduced in part 1, and then in part 2, the development of the plot, and 3, the plague rages and rages and rages, and 4, part 4, more deaths occur, but then in part 5, the denouement occurs, and so most of the characters that we meet do not make it. The only survivors really are Dr. Ryu and Rambert. Orthon dies. Cotard is carted off by the authorities after apparently really losing his mind. But Tarot has a horrible, horrible, painful death. And so about half the inhabitants of this city of 200,000 are killed. And if you go back and if you multiply the number of deaths per day times all those days of the year, and if you figure an average of 100 per day, that would take about 100,000 people out of a town of 200,000. So anyway, we're coming up.
Before we close, I want to read something toward the very end of the book, the second to the last page. Riol resolved to compile this chronicle so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure. And to state quite simply what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. And then the last paragraph closes with a caution, and it says, he knew that what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can be dormant, lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves, and that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and for the enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city.
Absolutely, exactly what I was going to read.
Sorry.
What do you think that means, everybody?
We need to go out and buy new furniture.
Janet, explain yourself.
Pardon me?
Explain yourself.
Well, I don't want all that stuff I don't want those cooties living in my stuff.
She owns stock in a furniture company.
Yeah. Perhaps I will.
Well, what, he's saying we all have the plague. Do you remember back in the book where, I think it's where Thoreau and Ryu first meet? Well, I can't remember exactly, but what Thoreau says at that point is that I have always had the plague. And he repeats that. And he repeats that in his story, in his backstory about his father, the prosecutor, and in how he came to be against all forms of capital punishment and war and so on. But what that means is what we said too at the beginning, we all have the coronavirus. In other words, we're all going to die. We will all die, and our innocent grandchildren are all going to die. And therefore, that is what Camus is talking about at the very, very end. But I think it's striking that he can, and as reviewers have pointed out, find so much positivity, particularly where he says, and what we learn in a time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. So, Judy, you picked the exact perfect quote for us to conclude on. I have one other quote from Camus that I just love, and I'd like to share it with you as part of the conclusion. But he wrote, and I'm sorry, but I don't know exactly where he wrote this, but I know it is from him. I've had it for years and years and years, written in my little book. And he wrote, In the depths of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. So I like that. But let's go around one last time. We've just got time for everybody to make one short comment on their like or dislike for the book and anything else to add. I can't see you, so Judy, you'll either have to read
Yeah,
off the
please unmute yourself, everyone, so that we can respond to Diana's question. We haven't heard yet from Andre. Do you have a comment, Andre?
Yes, I do. I've always loved Camus and read a number of his books. I very much appreciate your leading a conversation about the plague at this time. Initially, when I read that you were conducting this, I thought, oh my goodness, why would anyone want to read this at this time? But I thank you.
Thank you.
Teresa, could you unmute yourself and give us a comment, please?
I have not read the book. I was previously had an appointment this morning, and when my appointment was canceled, I thought, well, maybe I'll learn something to see if I want to read the book. And you've really piqued my curiosity.
Good.
Linda Winkleman?
Hi. Yeah, I also didn't pre-read the book, but will definitely do so. I did read a quick Cliff's Notes just before this started, and I was struck even in the notes that, and again in the commentary from all of you, how the whole panoply of responses is of characters in the book is very similar to what I see during this time period in our lives. And I can see many of the people I know in different character roles, kind of like little tiny vignettes of their personality, and also can see how I can improve myself.
Deborah Williamson, I see you, but you haven't commented. Perhaps you don't have the ability to comment, but.
I can comment, Judy.
Okay.
I read the book many years ago. It was very influential in my own life as the way I see things. I'm a big believer in randomness, and that's about all I'll say. It's nice to see all of you folks.
Kathy Walton, any comments from you?
I didn't comment earlier because I also didn't read the book, but it sounds like a fascinating book, and I think I'm going to put it on my list of books to read. And thank you. It was a nice class, even though I hadn't read the book.
Sharon Aaronsworth, any comment?
I did read the book. It was interesting though, because we were in the midst of the coronavirus now, I read it completely as a plague and didn't do any of the extrapolation to it may represent something else. And I'm sure had we not been in the midst of the coronavirus, I probably would have read it at those different levels that you all introduced in your discussion. But one of the early things I marked was, after the doorman died, and there was a conversation, there was something about when other members of the community, not just the menials or the poor people, started to die, that's when the community started to take it seriously. And I thought, that certainly speaks to these times too. It's people outside and those that don't really matter died or are affected by different things in life. We in the big picture, powerful people we don't pay much attention. But then when it starts affecting everyone at different levels, suddenly it becomes of interest. And this is certainly happening now with the coronavirus.
Patty Brink, any comments?
Yes, I think that I'll put this on my list to read. I have a pile of about 25 books, so not sure when I'll get to it. Thank you so much. This was excellent.
Anyone else? Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll say something. I guess I also admittedly, I read a bunch of Cliff's Notes and the wiki and all that stuff because I didn't have time to read the book. But I'm struck by the fact that it seems like if you have a pandemic, you have similar problems. It's almost like he has written a script for what to expect if there's a pandemic. And it makes you wonder what could be done to change it. I'm also reading a book called The Great Influenza, which may also be coming up in the reading.
Yes, it will be.
It will be. And the guy who wrote the book was on TV. They interviewed him, and he said, they asked him, well, what did you take away from writing this book? And he said two things. One, tell the truth, and two, do the right thing the first time out of the chute. That's kind of sad to hear that, but anyway, I was glad to see, not glad to see, but I like the idea that this is kind of what happens when there's a pandemic. You get these cast of characters, you get the non-believers, you get the, that sort of thing. I think it's really interesting.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Diana.
Yeah, let's give her a round of applause. Let's give Diana a round of applause. Thank you, Diana. Do you want to give a plug for what's coming up in nonfiction books in the fall?
Oh, I certainly could do that. It's
Diana, you're muted.
Yourself.
You're muted.
That was my
Wait,
fault. Sorry. Go ahead now.
Okay, hi. I'm just going to quickly tell you that if you'd like to read more about a pandemic, the first book that Nonfiction Books is going to be discussing in October is called The Great Influenza, and it is about the flu here in this country in 1918, and the discussion will be led by Sue Bolander. Then after that, in November, we're going to read Black Wave, which is about the differences between Iran and Saudi Arabia and how that split happened in the Muslim world. And then in December, the nonfiction book group is going to read When Time Stopped, and that discussion of a girl who goes back to find out whether her father was a Nazi or a victim of the Nazis will be led by Norma. So thank you all for participating today, and thank you, Judy, my sort of co-host here, and thank you, Kim.
Thank you for the idea of this book to be discussed. It came from Diana.